Imagine controlling more wealth than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett combined. Now imagine doing it 800 years ago, when kings ruled by divine right and merchants were barely above peasants. That's exactly what happened in medieval Europe, when a secret network of traders built the most powerful economic empire the world had ever seen. The Hanseatic League controlled 200 cities across northern Europe. They owned private armies larger than most kingdoms. Their trade routes stretched from London to Novgorod, from Bergen to Bruges. At their peak, they generated wealth equivalent to $2.3 trillion in today's money, making them richer than most modern nations. But here's what nobody knows. These weren't just merchants. They were political masterminds who toppled kings, blockaded entire countries, and created Europe's first corporate state. When the King of Denmark tried to tax their ships, they didn't just protest. They invaded Denmark, captured the king, and forced him to sign away his crown. When England's merchants complained about unfair competition, the Hanseatic League didn't negotiate. They cut off England's entire wool trade, crashed their economy, and brought the English crown to its knees in 3 months. For over 500 years, this alliance of traders controlled who could fish where, who could sail which routes, and who lived or died by trade. They built cities from nothing, destroyed kingdoms with economic warfare, and accumulated more concentrated power than any organization in human history. Yet today most people have never heard of them. What made them unstoppable wasn't just money. It was a revolutionary system that turned individual merchants into an unbeatable collective force. They cracked the code of economic dominance centuries before anyone understood what capitalism even was. But their story isn't just about wealth. It's about what happens when unchecked corporate power collides with royal authority. It's about loyalty, betrayal, and the ultimate price of absolute control. This is the story of how a handful of German fish traders became more powerful than kings, and how their empire's collapse changed the course of European history forever. Picture Northern Europe in 1158. Vikings still raided coastal villages. Most people never traveled more than 10 miles from where they were born. Kings ruled through force. The Catholic Church controlled mines and merchants. They were nobodies, middlemen who carried goods between real powers. But in the bustling port city of Lübeck, something unprecedented was happening. German traders weren't content being overlooked. They'd discovered something revolutionary: collective bargaining. Not just for wages or working conditions, but for political power itself. These merchants realized that individually they were weak. Together they could move mountains. Heinrich de Loewe, Duke of Saxony, granted Lübeck special trading privileges in 1158. He thought he was simply encouraging commerce in his territories. What he actually did was plant the seed of Europe's first corporate superpower. Within decades, Lübeck's merchants had convinced dozens of other trading cities to join their alliance. Hamburg joined in 1241. Bremen followed in 1260. By 1300, over 80 cities had pledged loyalty to what became known as the Hanseatic League. Hanse, meaning guild or association in Middle Low German, but calling it a simple trade association misses the point entirely. This was economic warfare disguised as merchant cooperation. The League's founding principle was radical for its time. They would share information, coordinate prices, and present a united front against anyone who threatened their profits. If one member city was attacked, all member cities would retaliate. If one member was granted favorable trading terms, all members would demand the same. What started as mutual protection evolved into something far more ambitious: total market control. By 1350, the Hanseatic League had monopolized trade in the Baltic Sea, North Sea, and most major rivers in northern Europe. They controlled salt from Lüneburg, timber from Scandinavia, furs from Russia, fish from everywhere. Most importantly, they controlled the transportation networks that moved these goods. This wasn't just about buying low and selling high. The League mastered what modern economists call vertical integration. They owned the ships, the warehouses, the docks, and the trading posts. They controlled every step from production to final sale. But their real genius was political. Unlike kings who inherited power or nobles who held land, the League created a new form of authority: economic sovereignty. They proved that controlling trade routes could be more powerful than controlling territories. The League's structure was unlike anything Europe had seen. No single leader ruled them. Instead, they operated as a confederation of independent city-states, each contributing ships, soldiers, and gold to the common cause. Decision-making happened through assemblies called Hanseatags, essentially corporate board meetings, where merchant princes decided the fate of nations. At these assemblies, they didn't just discuss profit margins. They planned military campaigns, negotiated with kings, and divided up trading territories like modern corporations carving up market share. They created standardized weights, measures, and currencies across their network. They established their own legal system to settle disputes between member cities. Most remarkably, they pioneered concepts that wouldn't become common until centuries later: limited liability partnerships, maritime insurance, credit systems, and international banking. The League operated Europe's first stock exchanges, created the first international trade laws, and established the first standardized commercial contracts. By 1400, the Hanseatic League controlled 200 cities and trading posts from Lisbon to Smolensk. Their merchant fleets numbered over 3,000 ships, more than most royal navies. Their private armies could field 40,000 soldiers when needed. Their economic intelligence network rivaled anything the Vatican or royal courts could muster. They built this empire without conquering a single city through traditional warfare. Instead, they perfected economic conquest, making cities so dependent on League trade that opposing them meant economic suicide. But success bred arrogance. Power corrupted. As the League grew stronger, they began treating kings like business partners rather than sovereign rulers. They demanded tribute from royal houses. They blockaded kingdoms that displeased them. They acted like an independent nation while technically being subjects of various crowns. This set the stage for conflicts that would define European politics for the next 3 centuries. But to understand how simple fish traders became more powerful than kings, we need to go back to where it all began, to the muddy harbors of medieval Lübeck, where ambitious young merchants first dreamed of controlling the world. Chapter 1. Humble merchants. The smell hit you first in medieval Lübeck: rotting fish guts mixed with tar, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke from countless cooking fires. This wasn't the glamorous trading hub that would later rival Venice. This was 1143, and Lübeck was little more than a collection of wooden buildings surrounding a natural harbor on the Trave River. But one man saw something others missed. Heinrich de Loewe, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, stood on Lübeck's muddy docks watching local fishermen haul in their daily catch. Most nobles would have seen poverty and squalor. Heinrich saw opportunity. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting into dozens of competing duchies. Trade routes that had flourished under Charlemagne's unified rule were now choke points where local lords extracted tribute from passing merchants. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, every city gate meant another tax, another bribe, another cut of profits. Heinrich realized something revolutionary. Instead of fighting this system, what if you could bypass it entirely? Lübeck's location was perfect. Ships could sail directly from the Baltic Sea up the Trave River to the city's harbor. From there, goods could be transported overland just 14 miles to the Elbe River, then down to Hamburg and the North Sea. This route completely avoided the dangerous Sound, the narrow strait controlled by Danish kings who charged ruinous tolls. In 1158, Heinrich granted Lübeck a revolutionary charter. The city would be free from most ducal taxes. Merchants could govern themselves through their own guilds. Most importantly, any trader who established residence in Lübeck would enjoy protection throughout Heinrich's territories. What seemed like a simple land deal was actually Europe's first free trade zone. The response was immediate. Merchants flooded into Lübeck from across the Holy Roman Empire. Gotlanders brought furs and amber from the Baltic. Flemish traders arrived with fine cloth and metalwork. Russians hauled wax, honey, and precious furs down from Novgorod. But the real transformation began with a young merchant named Tiedemann von Limburg. Tiedemann wasn't born to wealth. His father was a minor craftsman in Würzburg who scraped together enough silver to send his son north with a single cart of low-grade wool. Most merchants in Tiedemann's position would have sold their goods quickly, taken their small profit, and returned home. Tiedemann stayed. He studied how successful traders operated. He learned that the key wasn't just buying and selling, It was understanding information flow. You see, in medieval times, news traveled at the speed of horses. A bad harvest in Novgorod wouldn't be known in Hamburg for weeks. A rich silver strike in Denmark might remain secret for months. The merchant who knew first could make fortunes. Tiedemann began cultivating relationships with ship captains, dock workers, and tavern keepers. He paid for drinks and remembered birthdays. He learned Russian curse words and Flemish drinking songs. Most importantly, he started lending small amounts of money to struggling traders. This wasn't charity. It was intelligence gathering. When a Russian fur trader needed emergency funds to repair his ship, Tiedemann provided the loan and learned about a massive beaver population discovery near Lake Ladoga. When a Danish sailor needed medicine for his sick wife, Tiedemann paid the herbalist and discovered that Danish fishing fleets were planning to expand into Prussian waters. By 1175, Tiedemann had transformed from a struggling wool merchant into Lübeck's premier information broker. He knew which routes were safe, which ports charged fair prices, and which nobles could be bribed. Other merchants began paying him for advice. But Tiedemann's breakthrough came during the Wendish Crusade crisis of 1177. Slavic pirates from Rügen Island had begun attacking merchant ships in the Baltic. Solo traders faced a terrible choice: risk losing everything to pirates or pay exorbitant fees for military escorts that ate up all their profits. Tiedemann proposed something radical: collective action. Instead of individual merchants hiring separate escorts, what if all Lübeck traders pooled their resources for shared protection? They could hire larger, more effective military forces. They could coordinate sailing schedules to move in protected convoys. Most importantly, they could negotiate as a unified group rather than desperate individuals. 23 Lübeck merchants agreed to Tiedemann's plan. They formed what they called a Hanse, an association for mutual protection and profit. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The Hanses' combined resources hired a fleet of war galleys that made short work of the Rügen pirates. Protected convoys reduced losses to nearly zero. Coordinated purchasing drove down the cost of ships, supplies, and insurance. But the real victory was psychological. For the first time, merchants realized they didn't have to accept whatever terms nobles dictated. United, they had leverage. Word of Lübeck's success spread quickly. Hamburg merchants formed their own Hanse in 1189. Bremen followed in 1260. By 1200, similar associations had formed in Cologne, Dortmund, and dozens of smaller cities. Yet these were still independent organizations. The leap from local cooperation to international coordination required a crisis that threatened everyone. That crisis came from an unexpected source: King Waldemar II of Denmark. In 1201, Waldemar conquered Estonia and began demanding tribute from all Baltic traders. Unlike local lords who settled for reasonable fees, Waldemar wanted 25% of all cargo value, enough to bankrupt most merchants. Individual cities protested but achieved nothing. Waldemar had the largest navy in the Baltic. He could blockade any port that defied him. But Tiedemann, now an old man but still sharp, proposed an unprecedented response. Instead of each city negotiating separately, what if all the Hanses presented a united front? The meeting took place in Lübeck City Hall on March 15, 1202. Representatives from 17 trading cities gathered around rough wooden tables. The discussion lasted 3 days. Tempers flared. Some delegates walked out. Others demanded impossible concessions. But on March 18th, they reached an agreement that changed European history. They would form a League of Hanses, a confederation of trading cities that would coordinate their commercial and military activities. Any attack on one member city would trigger retaliation from all member cities. Any favorable trading agreement negotiated by one member would extend to all members. Most importantly, they would pool their resources to build a Baltic fleet capable of challenging Denmark's naval supremacy. The Hanseatic League was born. Within months, the League's combined naval forces numbered over 200 ships. Their economic pressure forced Waldemar to reduce his tribute demands to 5%, still significant, but manageable. More importantly, they'd proven something revolutionary. Merchants could challenge kings and win. But this was just the beginning. The League's founders had unlocked a new form of power that would reshape European politics for the next 4 centuries. They'd discovered that control over trade routes could trump control over territories. As news of Denmark's concessions spread across northern Europe, ambitious merchants in dozens of cities began wondering if Lübeck's traders could force a king to back down, what else might be possible? Chapter 2. Secret Pacts. The letter arrived in Hamburg on a cold February morning in 1241, written in the careful Latin script that marked official Hanseatic correspondence. Conrad von Salzwedel, Hamburg's lead merchant, broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. He'd been expecting this invitation for months. The Hanseatic League wanted Hamburg to join their confederation. What made this moment so significant wasn't the invitation itself. It was what Hamburg's membership would represent. Unlike Lübeck, which controlled Baltic to North Sea routes, Hamburg dominated the Elbe River trade that connected inland German territories to the sea. Together, these two cities could control the most lucrative trade corridor in northern Europe. But there was a problem. Hamburg's merchants had thrived by playing different powers against each other. They sold goods to Danish kings while secretly funding their enemies. They negotiated favorable terms with local nobles while plotting to undermine their authority. Independence had made them rich. Joining the League meant giving up that independence. Conrad convened Hamburg's merchant council that evening in the Nikolaikirche, the city's oldest church, whose stone walls provided privacy for sensitive discussions. 37 merchants crowded into the building's side chapel, their fur-lined cloaks dripping melted snow onto ancient stone floors. The debate that followed revealed the fundamental tension that would shape the League's entire history, the conflict between individual profit and collective power. Johann von Lübeck, a wool trader who'd made fortunes during the Danish conflicts, argued against membership. Why should we share our profits with Lübeck? Why should we follow decisions made by merchants we've never met? Hamburg has prospered by staying flexible, making deals with whoever pays best. Joining this league turns us into someone else's servants. But Henning de Lange, whose family controlled most of Hamburg's salt trade, saw things differently. Look around this room. We're successful, yes, but we're also isolated. When Danish ships blockaded our harbor 3 years ago, who helped us? When Lüneburg tried to monopolize salt distribution, who stood with us? We survived because we were lucky, not because we were strong. The League offers something we've never had, guarantee of support when crisis comes. The discussion continued for hours. Some merchants worried about losing their competitive advantages. Others feared that Lübeck would dominate League decisions. A few questioned whether the League's military commitments might drain Hamburg's treasury. But as the night wore on, one concern overshadowed all others: the changing nature of European trade itself. By 1240, commerce was becoming too complex and too dangerous for individual cities to handle alone. Russian principalities were consolidating under Mongol influence, creating new opportunities but also new risks. English wool production was expanding rapidly, flooding traditional markets with cheaper goods. Most importantly, transportation costs were dropping as ship designs improved, making long-distance trade profitable for more merchants. This created what we'd now call economies of scale. The merchants who could coordinate large, complex transactions across multiple cities would dominate those who couldn't. Hamburg could either join the League and help shape this new system, or remain independent and gradually lose market share to better organized competitors. Conrad finally called for a vote at dawn. The result was closer than expected. 19 merchants voted to join the League, 18 voted against. Hamburg's narrow decision to join the Hanseatic League marked a crucial turning point. Not because Hamburg was particularly wealthy or powerful, but because it proved the League could attract major trading centers that had alternatives. But Hamburg's integration into the League revealed something more important: the sophisticated political mechanisms that made Hanseatic cooperation possible. You see, medieval alliances usually worked through personal relationships between nobles or religious obligations enforced by the church. The Hanseatic League pioneered something entirely new: institutional cooperation based on economic incentives. Here's how it worked. Each member city retained complete internal autonomy. Hamburg's merchants could still govern themselves, set their own tax rates, and make their own local regulations. But in matters affecting trade beyond their borders, they agreed to coordinate with other League cities. This coordination happened through a system of correspondences, regular exchanges of information about trade conditions, military threats and business opportunities. A merchant in Lübeck, who learned about a grain shortage in Novgorod, would immediately notify corresponding merchants in Hamburg, Bremen, and other member cities. This information sharing gave League merchants decisive advantages over competitors who lacked such networks. But information was just the beginning. The League's real innovation was mutual guarantee, the principle that all member cities would honor contracts signed by any member city. If a Hamburg merchant made a deal with Russian fur traders, that contract had the backing of the entire League. This dramatically reduced transaction costs and made complex international deals possible. The League also pioneered collective punishment as a tool of economic diplomacy. When the Count of Flanders tried to restrict League trading rights in Bruges in 1252, all League cities simultaneously banned Flemish merchants from their territories. Bruges' economy collapsed within 6 months. The Count not only restored League privileges, but granted additional concessions to prevent future boycotts. News of Bruges' capitulation spread rapidly across Europe. The Hanseatic League had demonstrated something unprecedented. Economic power could be more effective than military force in compelling political compliance. But the League's most secret weapon wasn't economic or military. It was psychological. Medieval Europe operated on hierarchies. Kings ruled nobles, nobles ruled merchants, merchants ruled craftsmen. Everyone knew their place in the social order. The Hanseatic League shattered that assumption by proving that merchants, properly organized, could challenge royal authority. This realization terrified European nobility. Chronicles from the period describe growing anxiety about merchant conspiracies and trader rebellions. The Count of Holstein wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor in 1248, "These Hanseatic cities act as if they are sovereign princes rather than subjects. They negotiate with foreign powers, maintain private armies, and ignore royal commands when convenient. If we allow this to continue, what prevents every guild and association from claiming similar independence?" The Count's fears were justified. The League's success inspired similar organizations across Europe. Italian city-states formed commercial leagues. Flemish cloth towns created trading associations. Even English merchants began exploring collective action. But the Hanseatic League remained the most successful because they alone had solved the fundamental problem of medieval cooperation: enforcement. In an era without effective central authority, making agreements work required credible threats of punishment. The League created this through economic interdependence. Member cities became so integrated that betraying the League meant destroying their own prosperity. Consider Wisby, the League's newest member in 1280. This small island city off Sweden's coast had joined primarily for military protection against Danish raids. But within 5 years, 60% of Wisby's trade flowed through League networks. Wisby's merchants relied on League contacts for everything from ship financing to cargo insurance. Breaking away from the League would have meant economic suicide. This interdependence created what modern economists call collective action without coercion. League cities followed agreements not because they were forced to, but because violation would hurt them more than anyone else. Yet the League's growing power was creating new problems. Success attracted attention from royal courts that had previously ignored merchant activities. Kings were beginning to realize that the Hanseatic League controlled resources they needed: tax revenue from trade, ships for naval warfare, and credit for financing military campaigns. The first serious challenge came from an unexpected source: Magnus Eriksson, the 16-year-old king of Sweden and Norway. In 1356, Magnus announced new regulations requiring all foreign merchants to pay licensing fees and accept Swedish oversight of their business activities. The fees weren't enormous, about 2% of cargo value, but the precedent was dangerous. If Sweden could impose such requirements, every kingdom would demand similar tribute. The League faced a critical test. They could negotiate with Magnus and accept reduced profits. They could try to bribe Swedish officials and hope for favorable treatment. or they could demonstrate that challenging the Hanseatic League carried unacceptable costs. They chose the demonstration. On September 12, 1356, every Hanseatic ship in Swedish waters simultaneously departed for League ports. League cities banned Swedish merchants from their territories. Swedish goods were prohibited in League markets. Within weeks, Sweden's international trade had virtually ceased, but the League went further. They sent agents throughout Europe, spreading stories about Swedish commercial unreliability. They offered preferential treatment to merchants who cancelled Swedish contracts. They coordinated with competing kingdoms to ensure alternative suppliers for goods Sweden typically exported. Magnus held out for 8 months, convinced that Sweden could outlast merchant stubbornness. He was wrong. By May 1357, Swedish nobles were demanding he rescind the new regulations. Sweden's treasury was empty. Food shortages were developing in cities that depended on imported grain. Magnus capitulated completely, not only repealing the merchant licensing requirements, but granting the League extensive new privileges. Exclusive fishing rights in Swedish waters, exemption from most royal taxes, and the right to establish permanent trading posts in Stockholm and Kalmar. The Swedish victory established the Hanseatic League's reputation across Europe. They'd proven that economic warfare could bring kingdoms to their knees more efficiently than military campaigns, but success created new enemies. The League's demonstration of power had impressed merchants and terrified kings. Royal courts across Europe began developing strategies to contain or destroy the Hanseatic threat. The next challenge would test whether merchant cooperation could survive royal determination to restore traditional hierarchies. And it would come from the most dangerous enemy the League had yet faced, a king who understood economics as well as they did. Chapter 3. Trade Monopoly. Bergen's harbour in 1294 looked like something from a merchant's fantasy. Hundreds of ships crowded the waterfront, sleek Hanseatic cogs loaded with German beer and grain, broad Norwegian vessels carrying dried cod and whale oil, and smaller boats from dozens of different cities carrying everything from amber jewelry to religious relics. But look closer, and you'd notice something unusual. Nearly every major transaction was being conducted by men wearing identical brass pins on their cloaks, the mark of the Hanseatic League. This wasn't coincidence. It was the result of the most sophisticated economic strategy medieval Europe had ever seen. The League had spent the previous 50 years perfecting what they called systematic market capture, identifying essential trade goods and gradually gaining control over their production, transportation, and distribution. Bergen represented their greatest success, a complete monopoly over Northern Europe's fish trade. Fish might seem like an odd foundation for an economic empire, but in medieval times, it was one of the most valuable commodities in existence. The Catholic Church required fish consumption during Lent and other religious fasting periods, roughly 150 days per year. With no refrigeration technology, only certain types of fish could be preserved long enough for international trade. Herring and cod from Baltic and North Sea waters were perfect. They could be salted, dried, and stored for months without spoiling. More importantly, these fish populations were concentrated in waters controlled by relatively weak kingdoms that couldn't effectively resist Hanseatic pressure. The League's fish monopoly began with a simple observation by Magnus Eriksson, not the Swedish king but a Lübeck merchant who shared the name. In 1230, Magnus noticed that herring prices in inland German cities were 5 times higher than prices in Baltic fishing ports. The problem wasn't scarcity. Fishermen were catching more herring than they could sell. The problem was transportation and preservation. Most fishing operations were small-scale family businesses that lacked capital for proper preservation equipment or reliable transportation to distant markets. They sold their catch to local middlemen for whatever prices they could get, often barely covering their costs. Magnus proposed a revolutionary solution. The League would provide capital and technical expertise to fishing operations in exchange for exclusive purchase agreements. Here's how it worked. League merchants would advance silver to fishing families at the beginning of each season, allowing them to buy better nets, hire more workers, and build proper salt-curing facilities. In return, the fishing families agreed to sell their entire catch to League merchants at predetermined prices. This seemed like a fair deal. Fishermen got capital they needed and guaranteed sales. League merchants got reliable fish supplies for their international trade networks. But the League's strategy was more sophisticated than most fishermen realized. The predetermined prices were carefully calculated to keep fishing families comfortable but dependent, high enough that they could pay their debts and maintain their boats, but low enough that they could never accumulate enough capital to become independent. Within 20 years, the League controlled 70% of herring production in the Baltic. By 1280, their control extended to cod fishing in Norwegian waters, salmon from Scottish rivers, and whale oil extraction from Greenlandic waters. But controlling production was only the first step. The League's real genius was vertical integration. They built the largest shipbuilding industry in Northern Europe, specifically designing vessels for fish transportation. League ships featured sealed compartments that could maintain proper temperature and humidity for preserved fish. They developed new techniques for salt curing that extended preservation time from weeks to months. They established storage facilities in major cities across the continent. Most importantly, they created the credit systems that made international fish trade possible. Medieval commerce operated on seasonal cycles. Fishermen caught most of their fish during specific months. Customers needed fish throughout the year. This timing mismatch created cash flow problems that traditional merchants couldn't solve. The League pioneered what we'd now call commodity futures, contracts allowing customers to purchase fish for delivery months in advance. A monastery planning for Lent could buy fish in September for delivery the following March. This provided fishermen with immediate payment and customers with guaranteed supply. But the real breakthrough was trade credit, the League's willingness to accept payment delays from reliable customers. When drought devastated grain harvests in Bohemia in 1268, monasteries couldn't pay immediately for fish deliveries. Traditional merchants would have demanded immediate payment or cancelled shipments. The League continued deliveries and accepted grain payments after the next harvest. This flexibility gave League merchants decisive advantages over competitors. Customers preferred dealing with traders who understood their economic cycles. Suppliers appreciated partners who provided capital and technical assistance. By 1290, the Hanseatic League controlled approximately 80% of fish trade in Northern Europe. They set prices that hundreds of thousands of people paid. They determined which regions had adequate food during religious fasting periods. They controlled economic lifelines for coastal communities from Scotland to Russia. But their fish monopoly was just the foundation for something much more ambitious: total control over Baltic trade. The strategy emerged during the Great Hanseatic of 1293, the League's most important assembly to date. Representatives from 46 cities gathered in Lübeck to address a growing problem: increasing competition from Italian merchants who were expanding into Northern European markets. Italian traders had several advantages. They had more sophisticated banking systems, developed during centuries of Mediterranean commerce. They had better relationships with the Catholic Church hierarchy. Most importantly, they had access to luxury goods from Asia that Northern European merchants couldn't provide. The League faced a choice: compete directly with Italian merchants on their terms, or change the rules of competition entirely. They chose to change the rules. Instead of trying to match Italian advantages in luxury goods, the League would make luxury goods irrelevant by controlling necessity goods so thoroughly that Italian merchants couldn't establish profitable operations in Northern European markets. This required expanding beyond fish into other essential commodities: salt, timber, grain, and furs. Salt was crucial for food preservation and industrial processes. The League had already gained significant influence over salt production in Lüneburg through loans to salt works operators. They expanded this strategy across the Baltic, providing capital to salt producers in exchange for exclusive purchase agreements. Timber was essential for construction and shipbuilding. Northern European forests produced the highest quality wood in the continent. The League negotiated agreements with local nobles, providing military protection and commercial expertise in exchange for exclusive timber export rights. Grain fed most of Europe's population. The League couldn't control agricultural production directly, but they could control grain storage and transportation. They built massive granaries in member cities and developed sophisticated systems for moving grain from surplus regions to deficit regions. Furs provided warmth and status symbols for Europe's wealthy classes. Russian and Scandinavian trappers produced the finest furs available, but they lacked access to international markets. The League created trading posts throughout fur-producing regions, offering trappers better prices than local buyers in exchange for exclusive supply agreements. But the League's masterstroke was coordination between these different monopolies. A city that challenged the League's fish prices might find their salt deliveries delayed. A kingdom that restricted League timber exports might discover that grain shipments were redirected to their enemies. A noble who supported Italian competitors might learn that fur traders no longer visited his territories. This wasn't crude economic coercion. It was sophisticated market manipulation that made opposing the League economically irrational. Consider what happened to Stockholm in 1295. Swedish merchants complained that League fish prices were too high and began importing fish directly from Norwegian suppliers. The League's response was swift and devastating. They stopped salt deliveries to Stockholm, making fish preservation impossible. They redirected grain shipments meant for Swedish markets to Danish ports. They instructed League timber merchants to avoid Swedish territories. Within 6 months, Stockholm faced food shortages, industrial shutdowns, and construction delays. Swedish merchants weren't just paying higher prices for fish, they were paying higher prices for everything, because the League controlled the integrated supply chains that made modern commerce possible. Stockholm's merchants surrendered unconditionally, accepting League price terms and agreeing to purchase minimum quantities of fish annually. But the League's growing power was creating unexpected consequences. Their success had made them targets for royal courts that were finally beginning to understand the threat they represented. The most dangerous enemy emerged from England, a kingdom that was developing its own strategies for economic warfare. King Edward the Fiend had been watching the League's expansion with growing alarm. English wool exports provided crucial revenue for royal finances, but League merchants controlled the ships that transported English wool to continental markets. They controlled the credit systems that financed wool production. They controlled the trading networks that determined wool prices. Edward realized that England's economic independence was an illusion. The Hanseatic League could devastate English commerce whenever they chose. In 1297, Edward announced the Statute of Merchants, new regulations requiring all foreign traders to register with royal authorities, pay substantial licensing fees, and accept English oversight of their business activities. The statute was clearly aimed at the Hanseatic League. Edward was testing whether royal authority could still trump merchant power. The League's response would determine whether their economic empire could survive political opposition from major kingdoms. More importantly, it would establish whether Europe's future would be shaped by royal courts or merchant assemblies. The confrontation that followed would reshape both English and Hanseatic history. It would prove that the League had become something unprecedented in European politics, a power that kings could neither ignore nor safely challenge. But first, they had to survive Edward's determination to restore traditional hierarchies. The battle for economic supremacy was about to begin. Chapter 4. Naval Dominance. The Battle of Sluys in 1340 marked a turning point in medieval naval warfare, but not for the reasons most historians remember. Yes, English longbow tactics devastated the French fleet. Yes, Edward III secured English control over the Channel. But hidden in the battle's aftermath was a more significant development, the Hanseatic League's emergence as Europe's premier naval power. While England and France exhausted their treasuries fighting each other, the League had quietly built the largest and most technologically advanced fleet the world had ever seen. By 1350, the Hanseatic fleet numbered over 1,000 ships, more than the combined navies of England, France, Denmark, and Norway. But numbers alone don't explain their dominance. The League had revolutionized naval technology, tactics, and strategy in ways that gave them decisive advantages over traditional royal navies. Their secret was systematic innovation, driven by commercial necessity rather than military tradition. Royal navies were designed for battle. Hanseatic ships were designed for profit. This difference in purpose led to radically different approaches to naval architecture, crew training, and fleet organization. The League's signature vessel was the cog, a ship design that perfectly embodied their priorities. Unlike royal warships that sacrificed cargo space for weapons, cogs maximized carrying capacity while maintaining defensive capabilities. A typical League cog could transport 200 tons of cargo while carrying enough armaments to fight off pirates or hostile warships. But the real innovation was standardization. Royal fleets consisted of whatever ships nobles contributed. Different sizes, different designs, different capabilities. League cogs were built to identical specifications across their entire network. This meant standardized parts, standardized crew training, and standardized tactics. When a League ship needed repairs in Bergen, the replacement parts would fit perfectly, even if the ship was built in Lübeck. When crews transferred between vessels, they already knew where everything was located. When multiple ships operated together, captains could execute complex maneuvers without extensive coordination. This standardization enabled the League to maintain their vast fleet at a fraction of the cost required by royal navies. But the League's naval supremacy rested on more than superior ship design. Their real advantage was strategic thinking that treated naval power as an integrated system rather than a collection of individual vessels. The concept emerged during the Danish War of 1361-1370, a conflict that would establish the League as Europe's dominant naval power. King Waldemar IV of Denmark had been gradually restricting League trading privileges throughout his territories. In 1361, he captured the island of Gotland, which controlled access to Russian trade routes. This wasn't just a territorial conquest, it was a direct attack on the League's economic lifelines. Traditional medieval warfare would have required the League to assemble their fleet, sail to Danish waters, and hope to defeat Waldemar's navy in decisive battle. Victory would depend on wind conditions, tactical skill, and luck. The League chose a different approach, naval siege warfare. Instead of attacking Danish strength, they would strangle Danish weakness. Denmark's economy depended on agricultural exports and imported manufactured goods. Most of this trade flowed through the narrow straits between Denmark and southern Sweden. The League would simply close those straits. On May 15, 1362, 50 League warships took position in the Sound, the narrow waterway between Copenhagen and Malmö. Their mission wasn't to conquer Danish territory, but to prevent any ship from entering or leaving Danish waters. The blockade was brilliantly executed. League ships operated in rotating patrols that maintained constant coverage without exhausting any single crew. Supply ships provided fresh water, food, and replacement personnel on regular schedules. Workshops established on nearby Swedish islands performed maintenance and repairs. Most importantly, the League had solved the fundamental problem of medieval siege warfare: logistics. Traditional armies couldn't maintain sieges for long because feeding large numbers of soldiers required supply trains that were vulnerable to enemy attack. The League's naval siege was self-sustaining because their ships could transport their own supplies from distant League territories. Within months, Denmark's economy was collapsing. Grain exports couldn't reach foreign markets. Essential imports like salt, metal, and manufactured goods couldn't enter Danish ports. Danish merchants were losing fortunes. Danish nobles were facing bankruptcy. But Waldemar refused to negotiate. He believed Danish honor was at stake and that foreign merchants shouldn't dictate terms to royal authority. The League escalated their pressure through what they called selective enforcement. Ships carrying Danish goods were seized wherever League vessels encountered them, even in neutral waters. League merchants in foreign ports refused to honor contracts with Danish traders. League cities banned Danish diplomatic representatives. This economic warfare was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. The League was treating Denmark not as a sovereign kingdom, but as a competitor business that needed to be driven into bankruptcy. The strategy worked. By spring of 1363, Danish nobles were demanding Waldemar end his confrontation with the League. Danish cities were petitioning for royal intervention to restore trade. Danish clergy were complaining that church finances were suffering due to reduced commercial taxation. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: naval technology. During the blockade, League shipwrights had been experimenting with new weapons systems designed specifically for naval siege warfare. Traditional naval battles relied on ramming, boarding, and hand-to-hand combat. Siege warfare required different capabilities: long-range accuracy, sustained bombardment, and psychological intimidation. League engineers developed an early form of naval artillery, large crossbow mechanisms that could launch heavy bolts over 300 yards with enough force to penetrate ship hulls. More importantly, they created incendiary projectiles that could set enemy vessels on fire from considerable distances. When Waldemar finally attempted to break the blockade in August 1363, his fleet encountered weapons they'd never seen before. Danish ships found themselves under accurate fire from ranges where their own weapons were useless. Several vessels were set ablaze before they could close to combat distance. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. 12 Danish ships were sunk or captured. The remainder fled back to Copenhagen's harbour. Denmark's naval defeat was complete. Waldemar had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 gave the League everything they'd demanded and more. They received exclusive trading rights throughout Danish territories. They gained control of several Danish castles and fortified ports. Most importantly, they secured the right to approve or reject future Danish kings. The League had achieved something unprecedented. A commercial organization had forced a sovereign kingdom to accept limitations on royal succession. News of Denmark's capitulation spread rapidly across Europe. The Hanseatic League had demonstrated that naval power, properly applied, could accomplish what traditional armies couldn't. They'd proven that economic objectives could justify military action and that merchant interests could override royal authority. But the Danish victory created new challenges. The League's naval supremacy had made them targets for other European powers who were beginning to coordinate against what they saw as a merchant conspiracy threatening royal prerogatives everywhere. The most serious threat emerged from an unexpected alliance between England and Norway. English merchants had been complaining about League competition for decades. Norwegian kings resented League control over their timber and fish exports. Both kingdoms had strong naval traditions and access to revenues that could finance large fleets. In 1372, they signed a secret agreement. England would provide financing and naval expertise for a joint fleet designed specifically to challenge League dominance in northern European waters. Norway would provide ships, bases, and local knowledge of Baltic conditions. The Anglo-Norwegian alliance represented the first coordinated effort by royal powers to destroy the League through military action. Unlike previous conflicts that focused on specific trade disputes, this was an existential battle for control over northern European commerce. The League's response would test whether their naval innovations could survive professional military opposition. More importantly, it would determine whether commercial interests could maintain supremacy over royal authority when kingdoms were willing to cooperate against merchant power. But the League had learned crucial lessons from their Danish victory. Naval supremacy required more than superior ships and tactics. It required control over the economic resources that made naval warfare possible. The coming conflict would prove that the Hanseatic League had become something no medieval kingdom could safely challenge: an economic empire with the naval power to enforce its commercial will against any opposition. The Anglo-Norwegian alliance was about to discover that the League's ships were the least dangerous part of their military capabilities. Chapter 5. Political Control. The coronation of Eric of Pomerania as King of Denmark in 1397 looked like any other medieval royal ceremony. Bishops blessed the crown, nobles swore fealty, citizens cheered in the streets of Copenhagen. But hidden among the ceremonial observers were 12 men wearing the brass pins of Hanseatic League merchants. They weren't there to celebrate. They were there to collect on a debt that had taken 30 years to arrange. Eric's coronation was the culmination of the most sophisticated political conspiracy medieval Europe had ever seen. The Hanseatic League had spent 3 decades systematically infiltrating, influencing, and ultimately controlling the mechanisms of royal succession in Denmark. This wasn't conquest through military force. This was conquest through financial manipulation and political patience. The strategy had begun during the chaotic aftermath of King Waldemar IV's death in 1375. Denmark faced a succession crisis that would determine the kingdom's future for generations. The League saw opportunity. Medieval succession disputes were usually resolved through military strength or noble support. The League pioneered a third option, economic leverage so decisive that military and political considerations became irrelevant. Here's how they did it. When Waldemar died, 3 different claimants had legitimate arguments for the Danish throne. Olaf Håkonsson had the strongest hereditary claim but was only 5 years old and controlled by his mother, Queen Margaret. Albert of Mecklenburg controlled significant military forces but lacked support from Danish nobles. Eric of Pomerania had minimal hereditary rights but crucial backing from the church. Traditional medieval politics would have supported the candidate with the best combination of legal claim and military power. The League chose to support the candidate they could control most effectively. They analyzed each claimant's financial situation, political dependencies, and personal vulnerabilities. Olaf was too young to make independent decisions. Albert was too strong to need League support. Eric was perfect, ambitious enough to want the throne, weak enough to need help getting it, and desperate enough to pay whatever price the League demanded. The League's strategy was breathtakingly comprehensive. They provided Eric with the financing needed to buy noble support. They used their trade networks to gather intelligence on his rivals' military preparations. They coordinated with League cities to ensure Eric's supporters received favorable treatment, while his opponents faced economic pressure. But the real genius was their use of ecclesiastical leverage. The Catholic Church controlled significant political influence in medieval succession disputes. Papal approval could legitimize weak claims. Church opposition could undermine strong ones. The League had spent decades building relationships with church hierarchy through strategic donations, favorable trade terms, and commercial partnerships. When Eric needed church support for his succession claim, the League's ecclesiastical contacts proved decisive. They arranged meetings between Eric and key bishops. They provided the gold Eric needed for substantial church donations. Most importantly, they used their influence to ensure Eric's rivals couldn't secure competing church endorsements. By 1380, Eric had assembled a coalition of Danish nobles, foreign military support, and church backing that made his succession inevitable. But this support came with conditions that effectively transferred real power from the Danish crown to the Hanseatic League. The secret agreement signed between Eric and the League in 1381 was one of the most extraordinary documents in medieval European history. In exchange for League support, Eric agreed to grant the League permanent trading privileges that couldn't be revoked by future Danish kings, provide League merchants with tax exemptions that effectively made them immune to royal revenue collection, accept League oversight of Danish foreign policy regarding trade and navigation issues, allow League representatives to participate in Danish royal councils when commercial matters were discussed. Most remarkably, Eric agreed that future Danish kings would require League approval before assuming the throne. This last provision transformed Denmark from an independent kingdom into what was essentially a League protectorate. The League had achieved something unprecedented: constitutional control over royal succession in a major European kingdom. But Denmark was only the beginning. The League's success there provided a template for political manipulation that they would apply across Northern Europe. The next target was Norway. King Håkon Sikkest of Norway died in 1380, leaving another succession crisis. His heir, Olaf, was the same child who had claims to the Danish throne. This created an opportunity for political consolidation that the League couldn't ignore. If they could ensure the same ruler controlled both Denmark and Norway, they would effectively control the entire Scandinavian peninsula. More importantly, they would control the naval choke points that dominated Baltic and North Sea access. The League's strategy in Norway revealed how sophisticated their political operations had become. Instead of supporting a single candidate, they manipulated the succession dispute to ensure that whoever eventually became king would be dependent on League support. They provided financing to multiple claimants, creating debt obligations that could be collected regardless of who won. They used their intelligence networks to gather compromising information about rival candidates. They coordinated with League cities to ensure Norwegian trade remained profitable, only for merchants who supported League-friendly succession outcomes. Most ingeniously, they created economic hostages. situations where Norwegian nobles' personal wealth depended on continued League support. For example, Bergen's leading noble families had invested heavily in League-financed trading ventures. If they supported candidates opposed to League interests, those investments would become worthless. If they supported League-preferred candidates, their wealth would increase substantially. By 1387, the League controlled sufficient political influence in Norway to ensure that Queen Margaret, Oluf's mother and regent, accepted their conditions for supporting Norwegian-Danish union under League oversight. The Kalmar Union of 1397, which united Denmark, Norway and Sweden under a single crown, was officially a Scandinavian political achievement. In reality, it was a Hanseatic League political conquest disguised as royal consolidation. Eric of Pomerania's coronation as king of the United Scandinavian Kingdoms marked the peak of League political power. They controlled the rulers of territories stretching from Greenland to the Baltic. They had transformed 3 independent kingdoms into client states of a merchant confederation. But the League's political success created new vulnerabilities that they hadn't anticipated. Royal authority in medieval Europe operated through personal relationships and traditional legitimacy. The League had gained control over kings, but they couldn't gain control over the cultural foundations of royal power. Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish nobles accepted League influence as a temporary necessity during succession crises. They assumed that once stable royal authority was re-established, traditional relationships between kings and merchants would be restored. The League had miscalculated the psychological impact of their political success. Their control over royal succession was so unprecedented that it generated nationalist reactions they weren't prepared to handle. The backlash began in Sweden, where nobles had reluctantly accepted the Kalmar Union, but had no intention of accepting permanent League dominance over Swedish affairs. In 1434, Swedish noble Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson launched a rebellion that explicitly targeted League political influence rather than royal authority. His message was simple: Swedish nobles should rule Sweden, not German merchants. The rebellion revealed the fundamental weakness in the League's political strategy. They had gained control over kings, but they hadn't gained control over the military forces that kept kings in power. When Swedish nobles decided to oppose League influence, the League discovered that their political control was more fragile than they'd realized. More importantly, Engelbrekt's rebellion inspired similar movements across Northern Europe. Danish nobles began questioning why foreign merchants should influence Danish royal succession. Norwegian nobles started demanding restrictions on League trading privileges. Even in the Holy Roman Empire, princes began viewing the League as a threat to traditional political order. The League faced a crucial choice: escalate their political control into outright territorial conquest, or accept limitations on their political influence that might undermine their economic empire. The decision they made would determine whether the Hanseatic League would become Europe's first merchant republic or remain a commercial confederation operating within traditional political structures. But first, they had to survive the royal coalition that was forming against them. Kings across Europe had finally recognized the League as an existential threat to royal authority itself. The political revolution the League had started was about to face its ultimate test. Chapter 6: Royal Conflicts. The secret meeting took place in Windsor Castle on October 31st, 1410, a date chosen deliberately for its ominous associations. King Henry IV of England had summoned representatives from 5 European kingdoms to discuss what his private correspondence called the merchant problem. Around the great oak table in Windsor's private council chamber sat some of Europe's most powerful figures: Louis of Anjou representing France, Eric of Pomerania speaking for the Scandinavian kingdoms, ironically given his dependence on League support, Władysław Jagiełło from Poland-Lithuania, and Ruprecht of the Palatinate from the Holy Roman Empire. The Hanseatic League wasn't invited. That was the point. For the first time in their history, European royalty was coordinating specifically to contain merchant power. The League had become so successful that kings who were normally bitter enemies were willing to cooperate against what they saw as a fundamental threat to the entire concept of royal authority. Henry opened the discussion with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, We face an enemy unlike any in our histories. The German merchants don't seek to conquer our lands, they seek to make our lands irrelevant. They don't challenge our armies, they make our armies financially impossible. They don't claim royal authority, they simply make royal authority meaningless. The evidence for Henry's concerns was overwhelming. English wool exports, once a reliable source of royal revenue, now generated more profit for League middlemen than for English producers. French salt production had become dependent on League distribution networks. Polish grain fed League cities before feeding Polish citizens. Most alarmingly, royal finances across Northern Europe had become dependent on League credit systems. When kingdoms needed to finance military campaigns or construction projects, they borrowed from League merchants because League merchants were the only lenders with sufficient capital. This financial dependence created a profound vulnerability. Kings who opposed League interests found their credit disappearing. Kingdoms that challenged League trade privileges discovered that essential imports suddenly became unavailable or prohibitively expensive. The Windsor Conspiracy, as historians would later call it, was designed to break this cycle of royal dependence on merchant power. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, simultaneous coordinated action that would overwhelm the League's ability to respond effectively. Each kingdom would implement restrictions on League trading privileges at exactly the same time. England would revoke League exemptions from wool export taxes. France would require League merchants to use French ships for all trade within French territories. Poland would establish royal monopolies over grain exports. The Holy Roman Empire would restrict League access to mining regions. Most importantly, all participating kingdoms would coordinate their actions to prevent the League from using economic pressure against individual targets. If the League boycotted English trade, England would continue receiving essential goods through French and Polish alternative suppliers. If the League redirected commerce away from French ports, France would be compensated through increased English and German business. The strategy was designed to exploit what the conspirators believed was the League's fundamental weakness: their dependence on cooperation from royal authorities they couldn't directly control. Henry concluded the Windsor meeting with a toast: "To the restoration of proper order, merchants serving kings, not kings serving merchants." The coordinated assault began on January 15, 1411. Across Northern Europe, royal proclamations announced new restrictions on Hanseatic trading privileges. League representatives were summoned to royal courts and informed that their special status was being revoked. League warehouses were subjected to inspections that had been waived for decades. The initial royal assumption was that the League would negotiate. Medieval political conflicts usually ended with face-saving compromises that preserved everyone's essential interests. The League would accept reduced privileges in exchange for continued access to royal territories. The League's response shattered that assumption. Instead of negotiating, they escalated. On February 1411, every League ship in northern European waters simultaneously departed for League home ports. League merchants throughout the continent liquidated their assets and transferred their capital to League cities. League trading posts closed their doors and dismissed their local employees. Within days, commerce in Northern Europe had virtually ceased, but this was only the beginning. The League's retaliation revealed the full extent of their economic integration into European society. League merchants controlled the transportation networks that moved goods between kingdoms. When they withdrew their ships, alternative transportation simply didn't exist on sufficient scale. French grain couldn't reach English markets. English wool couldn't reach Flemish cloth producers. Polish timber couldn't reach construction projects across the continent. League credit systems had become essential for international trade. When they suspended credit operations, merchants throughout Europe found themselves unable to finance commercial transactions. Trade that didn't involve the League directly still depended on League financial services. Most devastatingly, League withdrawal disrupted the food supply systems that fed major European cities. Medieval cities were utterly dependent on rural agricultural production, but they needed complex distribution networks to move food from farms to urban markets. The League had developed these networks over centuries. When they withdrew, cities from London to Stockholm began experiencing food shortages. By March 1411, The royal coalition was facing economic crisis more severe than anything they'd anticipated. Urban riots were erupting in cities affected by food shortages. Noble families were losing fortunes as their commercial investments became worthless. Church leaders were demanding royal action to restore trade that provided essential revenues for religious institutions. But the most serious problem was military. Medieval armies required enormous supplies of food, equipment, and transportation. The League's withdrawal had made large-scale military mobilization financially impossible just when the royal coalition most needed to demonstrate strength. The Polish experience illustrated the broader crisis. King Władysław had planned to use increased grain export revenues to finance military campaigns against the Teutonic Knights. League withdrawal eliminated those revenues and disrupted the transportation systems needed to move Polish armies. Instead of projecting strength, Poland found itself unable to defend its existing territories. Henry IV faced similar problems in England. Without League ships, English wool exports collapsed. Without League credit, English merchants couldn't finance the trading expeditions that had been expanding English commercial influence. Without League distribution networks, English cities faced shortages of essential goods they'd been importing for decades. The royal coalition had learned a devastating lesson. The League's economic integration into European society was far more complete than anyone had realized. Attacking League privileges meant attacking the economic foundations that supported royal power itself. By May 1411, the Windsor Conspiracy was collapsing. Individual kingdoms began negotiating separate agreements with the League rather than maintaining their coordinated resistance. France capitulated first, offering the League enhanced trading privileges in exchange for resuming commercial operations. Poland followed within weeks, granting League merchants access to territories that had been closed to foreign traders for centuries. England held out longest, but Henry's position became untenable when London's merchants petitioned Parliament demanding immediate restoration of League trading relationships. The Treaty of Marienburg, signed on August 12, 1411, didn't just restore League privileges, it expanded them significantly. The royal coalition agreed to compensate the League for losses incurred during the conflict. They accepted League participation in future trade negotiations. Most importantly, they recognized the League's right to suspend commercial operations if they perceived threats to their legitimate interests. The Windsor Conspiracy's failure marked a crucial turning point in European political development. Royal attempts to contain merchant power had not only failed, but had actually strengthened merchant influence over royal decision-making. More fundamentally, the conflict had revealed that the traditional medieval distinction between political authority and economic power was becoming meaningless. The League had demonstrated that controlling economic relationships meant controlling political relationships. The failed Windsor Conspiracy wouldn't be the last attempt to contain League power. Instead, it would be the beginning of a new phase of royal merchant conflict that would employ more sophisticated strategies and accept greater risks. The next royal challenge would target not the League's trading privileges, but the economic foundations that made League power possible. And it would come from a source the League had never seriously considered dangerous: the rising power of centralized nation-states that were beginning to understand economics as a tool of war. Chapter 7: Economic Warfare. The invoice arrived at Lübeck's Merchants' Hall on March 3, 1428, carried by a Danish messenger who seemed nervous about his cargo. The document was signed by King Eric VII of Denmark and addressed to the Assembly of German Merchant Cities. Its contents would trigger the most sophisticated economic war medieval Europe had ever witnessed. Eric was demanding 47,000 marks of silver as compensation for unlawful interference in royal Danish commerce, equivalent to roughly 100 million in modern currency. The claim was legally dubious, but Eric's timing was strategically brilliant. The Hanseatic League was facing internal tensions that threatened their unity for the first time in over a century. Conflicts between member cities over trade route priorities had been growing. Some League cities were questioning whether their military contributions were proportional to their commercial benefits. Most dangerously, newer member cities were challenging the dominance of founding cities like Lübeck and Hamburg. Eric had been monitoring these internal League discussions through an intelligence network that rivaled anything the League had developed. He knew the League's response to his demands would either restore their unity or shatter their confederation permanently. The Danish strategy was unprecedented in its sophistication. Rather than attacking League strength, Erik targeted League weaknesses. Rather than challenging their economic power directly, he forced them to choose between economic interests and political solidarity. Here's how Erik's trap worked. If the League rejected his compensation demands, Erik would implement trade restrictions specifically designed to hurt different League cities unequally. Cities dependent on Danish timber would face supply shortages. Cities relying on Danish agricultural imports would experience food price increases. Cities using Danish shipping routes would encounter prohibitive toll charges. But Erik's real genius was offering individual League cities exemptions from these restrictions in exchange for separate negotiations. Any League city that agreed to pay its proportional share of Erik's compensation claim would receive preferential trading status in Danish territories. This created a prisoner's dilemma that struck at the heart of League cooperation. Each city had incentives to negotiate separately rather than bear costs for collective resistance. But if multiple cities defected, the League's unified response would collapse and Erik's demands would be validated. The League's leadership recognized Erik's strategy immediately. Hermann von Hagen, Lübeck's senior representative, addressed the emergency assembly called to address Erik's demands. "The Danish king seeks not our silver, but our submission. If we pay his compensation, we acknowledge that royal authority supersedes merchant rights. If we allow individual cities to negotiate separately, we destroy the unity that makes our power possible." But Hermann's analysis, while accurate, didn't resolve the fundamental problem Erik had created. League cities were facing real economic pressure. Danish trade restrictions were already causing measurable losses. The theoretical importance of maintaining League unity offered cold comfort to merchants watching their profits disappear. The debate that followed revealed deep fractures in League solidarity that Erik's intelligence network had correctly identified. Cologne's representative argued for payment. 47,000 marks is substantial, but it's less than the losses we'll suffer if trade with Denmark ceases entirely. We've prospered by being practical, not by being proud. Bergen's delegate disagreed. If we surrender to Erik's demands, every king in Europe will present similar claims. We'll spend more on royal tributes than we earn from trade. Hamburg's spokesman proposed compromise. Why not negotiate Erik's compensation down to a reasonable amount? We've resolved similar disputes through bargaining rather than confrontation. But Lübeck's position remained firm. Any payment would set a precedent that would destroy the League's independence. The assembly deadlocked. For the first time in League history, member cities couldn't reach consensus on a major policy decision. Erik had achieved his primary objective without firing a shot or seizing a ship. The Hanseatic League was paralyzed by internal disagreement at the moment they most needed unified action. But Erik's success created an opportunity he hadn't anticipated. The League's internal crisis forced them to innovate in ways that ultimately strengthened their economic capabilities. Unable to rely on traditional consensus building, League leadership developed new decision-making procedures that allowed majority coalitions to act even when unanimous agreement was impossible. Unable to depend on member city loyalty, they created economic incentives that made defection more costly than cooperation. Most importantly, unable to assume their economic dominance was permanent, they began developing new strategies for economic warfare that were far more sophisticated than anything they'd used previously. The League's response to Erik's challenge would establish principles of economic warfare that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern international trade disputes. Instead of accepting or rejecting Erik's demands directly, the League launched a systematic campaign to destroy Denmark's economic independence. Phase 1 targeted Danish export industries. League merchants coordinated to find alternative suppliers for goods traditionally purchased from Denmark. Swedish timber replaced Danish lumber. Norwegian fish substituted for Danish catches. Polish grain supplanted Danish agricultural exports. This required massive coordination across League territories and substantial short-term costs to establish new supply relationships. But the League's centuries of commercial experience allowed them to execute these supply chain transitions with remarkable efficiency. Phase 2 focused on Danish import dependencies. League analysis had identified essential goods that Denmark couldn't produce domestically: salt for food preservation, metals for tools and weapons, luxury goods for noble consumption. League cities simultaneously restricted Danish access to these essential imports, not through formal prohibitions, which would have violated existing treaties, but through pricing strategies that made Danish purchases prohibitively expensive. Danish merchants found that salt prices doubled whenever they appeared at League ports. Metal goods became mysteriously unavailable when Danish buyers inquired about purchases. Luxury items were perpetually already sold to other customers. Phase 3 employed what the League called financial siege warfare, systematic disruption of Danish credit and banking relationships. Medieval commerce required sophisticated credit systems for financing international transactions. Danish merchants depended on League financial services for letters of credit, currency exchange, and commercial loans. The League didn't formally prohibit Danish access to financial services. Instead, they implemented enhanced security requirements that made Danish transactions so complex and time-consuming that Danish merchants couldn't compete effectively with merchants from other kingdoms. By autumn of 1428, Denmark's economy was experiencing systematic breakdown. Export revenues had collapsed as buyers found alternative suppliers. Import costs had skyrocketed as League restrictions drove up prices. Danish merchants were unable to finance commercial operations due to credit restrictions, but Erik still refused to withdraw his compensation demands. He'd invested too much political capital in confronting the League to surrender without achieving something that looked like victory. The stalemate continued through winter, with both sides suffering mounting losses. Danish cities were experiencing shortages of essential goods. League member cities were losing profits from reduced Danish trade. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Flemish merchants who had been watching the conflict with growing alarm. Flanders depended on stable northern European trade for their textile industry. Danish League economic warfare was disrupting supply chains that Flemish cloth production required. Flemish cities began pressuring their rulers to mediate the dispute before it spread further. The Flemish intervention changed the conflict's dynamics entirely. Instead of bilateral Danish League negotiations, the dispute became a multilateral European trade issue involving kingdoms and merchant organizations across the continent. The Treaty of Aalborg, signed in April 1429, established principles for resolving commercial disputes that would influence European trade law for centuries. Erik withdrew his compensation demands in exchange for League agreements to provide advance notification before implementing trade restrictions affecting Danish territories. The League secured confirmation of their rights to coordinate commercial policies among member cities. Most importantly, the treaty created institutional mechanisms for resolving future merchant-royal conflicts through arbitration rather than economic warfare. But the real significance of the Danish economic war wasn't the specific terms of its resolution. It was the demonstration that economic conflicts could be more destructive than military campaigns and required more sophisticated strategies for resolution. The Hanseatic League had proven that economic warfare could bring kingdoms to their knees without traditional military conquest, but they'd also learned that economic warfare created vulnerabilities they hadn't previously considered. Their demonstration of economic power had terrified royal courts across Europe. Their coordination among member cities had impressed rival merchant organizations. Their financial innovations had attracted attention from banking houses across the continent. The League's victory over Denmark was actually the beginning of new challenges that would test whether their economic empire could survive the success that made them targets for every ambitious power in Europe. Chapter 8. Internal Fractures. The Great Assembly of 1447 in Lübeck was supposed to be a celebration. Representatives from 83 Hanseatic cities had gathered to commemorate the League's most profitable year in history. Trade volumes had reached unprecedented levels. Member cities were prospering. The League's political influence extended from London to Novgorod. But beneath the ceremonial pageantry, something was rotting at the heart of the Hanseatic enterprise. Johann Töppinghusen, Lübeck's most senior merchant, opened the assembly with words that would prove prophetic. "We have become victims of our own success. The league that began as cooperation among equals has become competition among rivals. The unity that made us powerful is dissolving in the profits that power has brought us." The warning signs had been accumulating for years, but the League's leadership had been too focused on external challenges to address growing internal tensions. The fundamental problem was structural. The League had been designed for cooperation among small, struggling trading cities that needed mutual support to survive. But success had transformed these cities into wealthy commercial centers with resources and ambitions that didn't require League assistance. Hamburg had developed independent trading relationships with English merchants that were more profitable than League-coordinated commerce. Cologne had established private banking operations that competed directly with League financial services. Bergen had negotiated exclusive agreements with Norwegian nobles that gave them advantages over other League cities. These individual successes created collective problems that the League's founding structures couldn't address. The crisis came to a head during debates over the English question. English merchants had been challenging League trading privileges in London for decades. King Henry VI's government was supporting English merchants with subsidies and preferential regulations designed to undermine League competitiveness. The traditional League response would have been coordinated economic pressure against England until favourable terms were restored. But League cities had developed conflicting interests regarding English trade. Hamburg's prosperity depended on maintaining good relationships with English wool producers. Economic warfare against England would destroy Hamburg's most profitable commercial relationships. Cologne had invested heavily in English banking ventures that would become worthless if League English trade was suspended. Lübeck needed to demonstrate League power to discourage similar challenges from other kingdoms, regardless of short-term economic costs. Bergen's economy was largely independent of English trade, so they could support aggressive action without serious financial consequences. For the first time in League history, member cities had fundamental conflicts of interest that couldn't be resolved through compromise or negotiation. The debate grew heated. Cologne's representative accused Lübeck of pursuing prestige over profit. Hamburg's delegation threatened to negotiate independently with England if the League chose confrontation. Bergen's spokesman questioned whether cities that prioritized individual gain over collective strength deserved League membership. But the most devastating criticism came from Danzig, one of the League's newest and most prosperous members. Marcus von Danzig stood before the assembly and delivered what historians would later call the prophet speech, a systematic dismantling of the philosophical foundations that had made League cooperation possible. "Honored colleagues," Marcus began, "we gather here clinging to traditions that served us well when we were weak, but constrain us now that we are strong. The League was necessary when individual cities couldn't survive alone. But look around this hall. Do any of us truly need the League's protection anymore?" His analysis was brutally logical. Danzig controlled the grain trade from Eastern Europe through independent negotiations with Polish nobility. They had built their own fleet that rivaled the naval forces of many kingdoms. They had developed commercial relationships across Europe that didn't require League coordination. Why should Danzig's profits be limited by Lübeck's policies? Why should our trade be restricted by Hamburg's timidity? Why should our growth be constrained by Bergen's irrelevance to modern commerce? Marcus's speech articulated what many League cities had been thinking, but hadn't dared to express. The League had become a burden rather than a benefit for its most successful members. The immediate response was explosive. Lübeck's delegation accused Danzig of ingratitude and betrayal. Hamburg's representatives defended their commercial strategies as serving League interests. Smaller cities demanded assurance that League protection would continue despite internal disagreements. But the deeper problem was that Marcus's analysis was largely correct. The League's founding assumption that cooperation would benefit all members equally had proven false. Success had been distributed unequally based on geography, timing, and individual initiative. Cities that had prospered most were now those that had the least to gain from continued cooperation. The crisis deepened when Danzig announced their intention to negotiate independently with the Teutonic Knights regarding Eastern European trade routes. This was effectively a declaration of independence from League coordination. If Danzig could negotiate separately with the Teutonic Knights, other cities would demand similar freedom to pursue independent agreements with kingdoms and nobility throughout Europe. The League faced an existential question. Could they force member cities to prioritize collective interests over individual profits? Lübeck's leadership proposed enforcing unity through economic pressure. Cities that negotiated independently would lose access to League trading networks and financial services. Cities that violated collective decisions would face economic sanctions from other League members. But this strategy required League cities to sacrifice profits to punish defectors. Hamburg and Cologne, facing their own pressures for independent action, were reluctant to participate in sanctions that might eventually be applied against them. The Assembly deadlocked. For the first time in League history, they couldn't reach consensus on fundamental policy questions. The deadlock was broken by an unexpected external crisis that reminded League cities why cooperation had been valuable in the first place. Swedish King Charles V announced new restrictions on foreign merchant activities that would apply to all cities equally, regardless of their League membership status. Swedish territories would be closed to foreign traders except under royal licenses that required substantial payments and acceptance of Swedish oversight. Individual League cities lacked the resources to resist Swedish policy effectively. Hamburg couldn't challenge Swedish military power alone. Danzig's independent negotiations were useless against comprehensive royal restrictions. Cologne's banking innovations couldn't overcome Swedish determination to control their own trade. The Swedish crisis forced League cities to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their individual success had been possible only because the League's collective power had maintained favorable trading conditions across Northern Europe. But by 1447, that collective power was fragmenting. The League's ability to present unified responses to external challenges was being destroyed by internal competition among member cities. The Assembly concluded with what historians call the Pyrrhic Agreement, a compromise that temporarily preserved League unity while acknowledging that fundamental changes in League structure were inevitable. Cities agreed to maintain collective responses to external threats while gaining increased freedom to pursue independent commercial strategies that didn't conflict with League policies. This sounded reasonable in theory, but proved impossible to implement in practice. Almost every significant commercial opportunity involved potential conflicts with League policies or other member cities' interests. The Pyrrhic Agreement postponed the League's internal crisis, but didn't resolve it. League cities continued pursuing individual strategies that weakened collective coordination. External challenges continued, requiring unified responses that member cities were increasingly reluctant to support. The Hanseatic League had survived external enemies, royal opposition, and economic warfare. But they were discovering that success created internal challenges more dangerous than any external threat. The confederation that had been built on mutual necessity was being destroyed by individual prosperity. The unity that had made them powerful was being shattered by the profits that power had generated. The League's golden age was ending, not through military defeat or economic failure, but through the success that made cooperation seem unnecessary to the cities that had benefited most from collective action. The question now was whether the Hanseatic League could reinvent itself for an era when its member cities were no longer struggling merchants seeking mutual protection, but wealthy commercial powers pursuing individual ambitions that increasingly conflicted with collective interests. Chapter 9. Desperate Alliances. The letter that arrived at Lübeck's Merchants' Hall on September 14, 1494, bore the seal of the Grand Duke of Moscow, a power the Hanseatic League had dominated for centuries. But the tone of Ivan III's correspondence marked a dramatic shift in the balance between Russian and German merchants. To the Assembly of German Cities, Ivan wrote, "We acknowledge your past services to Russian commerce, but circumstances require new arrangements that better serve Russian interests. We propose partnership based on equality rather than your traditional dominance. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise the ultimatum beneath. Russia was offering the League a choice: accept reduced privileges in Russian territories or lose access to Russian markets entirely. This wasn't just another trade dispute. It was evidence that the Hanseatic League's 5-century dominance over Baltic and North Sea commerce was crumbling as rising nation-states developed the economic capabilities to challenge merchant confederations. The Russian crisis had been building for decades. Ivan's predecessors had gradually been consolidating control over territories that had previously operated as independent principalities. This political unification allowed Russia to coordinate economic policies across vast territories for the first time in their history. More importantly, Russian rulers had been studying Hanseatic methods and adapting them for royal use. They'd learned how to use collective action, economic pressure, and systematic coordination to achieve political objectives. The League's greatest strength, their economic organization, was being turned against them by rulers who understood commerce as well as they did. Ivan's letter marked the beginning of what historians call the Alliance Wars, the League's final attempt to preserve their fading power through increasingly desperate partnerships with forces they'd previously dominated or ignored. The League's first instinct was to find other partners who shared their interests in containing Russian expansion. But their traditional allies were facing their own challenges that limited their ability to support Hanseatic resistance. Denmark was struggling with internal rebellions that made foreign adventures politically impossible. Poland was fighting territorial disputes with the Ottoman Empire that absorbed most of their military resources. England was focused on domestic dynastic conflicts that left little attention for Baltic trade issues. This forced the League to consider partnerships they would have rejected during their years of strength. The most controversial alliance was with the Teutonic Knights, the military religious order that controlled territories throughout the eastern Baltic. For over 2 centuries, the League and the Teutonic Knights had been rivals competing for control over Eastern European trade. The Knights represented traditional feudal authority that the League had spent generations undermining. Their religious mission was incompatible with the League's commercial pragmatism. Their military methods were antithetical to the League's economic strategies. But by 1495, both organizations faced existential threats from the same source: rising nation-states that were eliminating the political fragmentation that had allowed both League commerce and knightly territories to flourish. The alliance negotiations revealed how dramatically the League's position had deteriorated. In 1250, the League could have dictated terms to the Teutonic Knights. League economic power could have brought Knight territories to their knees through commercial pressure. The League would have demanded concessions, territorial access, and economic privileges in exchange for any cooperation. In 1495, the League was negotiating from weakness. The Knights controlled territories the League needed for access to Russian markets. The Knights had military forces the League required for protection against Russian expansion. The Knights had political legitimacy that gave them advantages in dealing with royal courts. The resulting Treaty of Marienburg was a humiliating reversal of traditional Hanseatic dominance. The League agreed to provide financial support for Knight military operations. They accepted Knight oversight of League trading activities in eastern territories. Most significantly, they acknowledged Knight political authority over territories where League merchants had previously operated independently. But the Teutonic alliance, while politically humiliating, was strategically necessary. Combined League-Knight resources were sufficient to present credible resistance to Russian demands. Joint military and economic pressure might force Ivan to negotiate rather than simply impose new trading restrictions. The strategy failed catastrophically. Ivan's response to the League-Knight alliance was swift and devastating. Instead of backing down, he escalated his pressure by forming his own coalition with Sweden and Poland, kingdoms that had their own grievances against Hanseatic privileges. This created a geopolitical nightmare for the League. They were now facing coordinated opposition from multiple nation-states that controlled access to most of their traditional trading territories. Swedish participation in the anti-Hanseatic coalition was particularly damaging. Sweden controlled the naval choke points that dominated Baltic access. Russian-Swedish cooperation could effectively close the Baltic to League shipping whenever they chose. Polish involvement threatened the League's overland trade routes that connected German territories with Eastern European markets. Polish-Russian coordination could strangle League commerce from both maritime and terrestrial directions. The League found themselves fighting a three-front economic war against opponents who had learned to use Hanseatic methods more effectively than the League could deploy them. The crisis deepened when internal League divisions prevented effective responses to external threats. Hamburg's merchants were secretly negotiating with Swedish representatives to preserve their individual trading relationships regardless of broader League policies. Cologne was exploring independent agreements with Polish nobility that would protect Cologne's interests even if the League lost access to Eastern European markets. Most devastatingly, Danzig, the League's most prosperous Eastern member, was considering switching sides entirely. Danzig's prosperity depended on good relationships with Poland. If forced to choose between League loyalty and Polish cooperation, Danzig's commercial interests favored Poland. By 1496, the Hanseatic League was disintegrating under pressures they couldn't contain through traditional methods. Their desperate response was the Grand Alliance, an attempt to create a continental coalition that could preserve the political fragmentation necessary for League survival. The League sought partnerships with every European power that shared interests in preventing nation-state dominance over international commerce. They offered military support to Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in exchange for imperial backing against Russian expansion. They provided financial assistance to Danish nobles rebelling against royal centralization. They coordinated with Italian city-states facing similar pressures from French and Spanish territorial consolidation. The Grand Alliance looked impressive on paper. At its peak, it included over 40 different cities, principalities, and noble houses across Europe. The combined military and economic resources of Grand Alliance members exceeded those of any individual nation-state. But the alliance was fundamentally unstable because its members had conflicting rather than complementary interests. The Holy Roman Emperor wanted League support for his territorial ambitions in Italy, not for resistance to Russian expansion in the Baltic. Danish nobles wanted League military assistance against their own king, not coordination against external threats. Italian city-states needed League financial resources for Mediterranean trade wars that had nothing to do with Northern European commerce. The League was attempting to create unity among powers that shared only one common characteristic: opposition to centralized royal authority. But opposition to centralization didn't create positive shared objectives that could sustain long-term cooperation. The Grand Alliance collapsed in 1499 when the League couldn't provide simultaneous support for all their allies' conflicting demands. The Holy Roman Emperor abandoned the alliance when League military support proved insufficient for his Italian campaigns. Danish nobles negotiated separately with their king when League assistance failed to materialize at crucial moments. Italian city-states pursued their own diplomatic solutions when League coordination proved unreliable. The alliance's failure left the League isolated and vulnerable to the Russian-Swedish-Polish coalition that had grown stronger while the League was distracted by unsuccessful attempts at continental politics. By 1500, the Hanseatic League had lost access to most Russian markets, faced severe restrictions in Swedish territories, and was dealing with Polish interference in their traditional Eastern European trade routes. Their desperate alliance strategies had not only failed to preserve League power, but had actually accelerated their decline by revealing their weakness to enemies and disappointing potential supporters. The League faced a stark reality. The political and economic conditions that had made their commercial empire possible were disappearing. Nation-states were replacing the fragmented political authorities that League merchants had learned to manipulate. Centralized royal power was eliminating the local independence that had allowed League cities to operate as quasi-sovereign commercial principalities. The age of merchant confederations was ending. The age of national economies was beginning. The Hanseatic League could either adapt to these new realities or face extinction as a relic of medieval political arrangements. Their choice would determine not just the League's survival, but the future of commercial organization in European political development. Chapter 10. Final Collapse. On May 15, 1669, 9 elderly merchants gathered in Lübeck's Great Assembly Hall, for what they didn't realize would be the final official meeting of the Hanseatic League. The massive chamber that had once hosted representatives from over 200 cities now echoed with the footsteps of delegates from just 6 remaining member cities. Heinrich von Bergen, the League's last elected leader, called the meeting to order with words that captured the tragedy of their situation. "Honored colleagues, we gather not to plan new conquests, but to discuss whether our confederation has any purpose in a world that has left us behind." The agenda for that final meeting was heartbreakingly simple: whether to formally dissolve the Hanseatic League or continue pretending that a handful of nostalgic merchants could maintain an organization that had once challenged kings. The question wasn't whether the League was finished. That had been obvious for decades. The question was whether to acknowledge their defeat with dignity or cling to illusions that fooled no one. The League's collapse hadn't happened suddenly. It had been a gradual process of irrelevance that stretched across 2 centuries as the political and economic foundations of their power were systematically dismantled by historical forces they couldn't understand or control. The beginning of the end could be traced to 1517, when Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation shattered the religious unity that had provided ideological foundation for medieval European trade relationships. The Catholic Church had been the League's most reliable institutional partner. Church doctrine provided moral legitimacy for merchant activities that might otherwise have been viewed as exploitation. Church networks facilitated information exchange and credit relationships across linguistic and political boundaries. Church authority offered neutral arbitration for commercial disputes between merchants from different territories. The Reformation destroyed this religious infrastructure. Protestant territories developed their own commercial practices that didn't depend on Catholic Church mediation. Catholic territories became suspicious of merchants from Protestant cities. The shared cultural framework that had made international commerce possible fragmented into competing religious systems. But religious division was only the beginning of the League's problems. The real death blow came from the discovery of oceanic trade routes that bypassed northern European commerce entirely. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa in 1498, he did more than establish Portuguese trading posts in Asia. He proved that European merchants could access Asian luxury goods without depending on the overland routes that the Hanseatic League controlled. The development of Atlantic trade routes was even more devastating. When Spanish and Portuguese merchants began importing massive quantities of gold and silver from American colonies, they created new sources of wealth that dwarfed the profits from Baltic fish and timber. By 1550, the most profitable European trade involved commodities the League had never handled, flowing through routes the League had never controlled, to markets the League had never developed. The League's traditional strengths became irrelevant overnight. Their expertise in Baltic navigation was useless for Atlantic voyages. Their networks of trading posts couldn't compete with colonial empires that controlled entire continents. Their financial innovations seemed primitive compared to the banking systems developed to handle global commerce. More fundamentally, the political structure that had made League power possible was being replaced by centralized nation-states that operated according to different economic principles. Medieval trade had been conducted between independent cities that needed merchant confederations for coordination and protection. Early modern trade was conducted between national economies that could provide their own coordination and protection through royal authority. The League had thrived in a world of political fragmentation where no single authority controlled large territories. But by 1600, most of Europe was organized into centralized kingdoms that could coordinate economic policies across vast regions without merchant confederation assistance. Consider what happened to the League's traditional relationships with English commerce. In 1350, English merchants had been individual traders competing with each other for access to continental markets. The League's coordination gave them decisive advantages over disorganized English competitors. By 1550, English merchants operated as agents of a unified English national economy, directed by royal policies that prioritized English interests over international cooperation. The League's coordination advantages disappeared when they were competing against an entire nation rather than individual merchants. The same transformation occurred throughout Europe. French merchants became instruments of French royal policy, Spanish merchants served Spanish imperial objectives. Dutch merchants operated as components of a unified Dutch commercial empire. The League found themselves trying to compete with nation-states using methods designed for competition between individual cities. It was like trying to fight modern armies with medieval siege weapons. The League's final decades were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to find relevance in a world that no longer needed their services. They tried to reinvent themselves as military contractors, offering their remaining naval forces to kingdoms fighting the 30 Years' War. But their ships were obsolete compared to modern naval technology, and their military expertise was centuries out of date. They attempted to develop new trading relationships with emerging commercial powers like Russia and Ottoman Empire. But these negotiations revealed how completely the League's leverage had disappeared. They were negotiating as supplicants rather than equals. Most pathetically, they tried to lobby the Holy Roman Emperor to grant them special legal status that would protect League privileges regardless of economic realities. But the emperor's power was itself fragmenting under pressure from rising nation-states that recognized no authority superior to royal sovereignty. By 1650, the Hanseatic League existed primarily in the memories of elderly merchants who remembered when German trader confederation had been more powerful than kings. The meeting of May 15, 1669, was supposed to address proposals for League revival developed by Heinrich von Bergen and his advisors. Heinrich had spent months developing plans for modernizing League operations to compete with nation-state economies. His proposals were intelligent and well-reasoned. The League would abandon their traditional focus on Baltic trade and develop expertise in new commodities like tobacco and coffee. They would establish partnerships with emerging colonial powers to participate in global rather than regional commerce. They would modernize their financial services to compete with Amsterdam and London banking houses. But Heinrich's revival plans required resources the League no longer possessed and unity that no longer existed among member cities. Lübeck couldn't finance Atlantic trading expeditions. Hamburg was more interested in independent relationships with English merchants than in League coordination. Bremen had already effectively withdrawn from League activities to focus on their own municipal development. The debate that followed Heinrich's presentation was brief and dispiriting. Every revival proposal required investments that member cities were unwilling to make for collective benefits they no longer believed were achievable. The final vote was unanimous. The Hanseatic League would cease operations as a commercial confederation. Member cities would retain their individual identities, but would no longer coordinate their economic policies or present unified responses to external challenges. Heinrich von Bergen signed the dissolution papers with a comment that historians would remember. "We end not as failures, but as anachronisms. The world changed faster than we could adapt. Perhaps that is the fate of all who grow too comfortable with their success." The Hanseatic League's dissolution marked the end of an era in European commercial development. For over 5 centuries, they had proven that merchant cooperation could achieve political objectives that individual traders couldn't accomplish alone. Their innovations in international trade, maritime law, financial services, and economic cooperation had laid foundations for modern commercial civilization. Their demonstration that economic power could challenge royal authority had influenced political development throughout Europe. But their ultimate failure proved that commercial organizations, like individual businesses, must continually adapt to changing circumstances or face extinction. The League had become too attached to methods that had brought them success in medieval conditions to recognize that those conditions no longer existed. They had confused their historical achievements with permanent advantages that couldn't be challenged by new forms of organization. Their collapse didn't mean that international commercial cooperation had become impossible. It meant that such cooperation would require new methods appropriate for the age of nation-states and global trade. The merchants who had once controlled Northern European commerce would be replaced by national economies that operated on scales the League's founders couldn't have imagined. The political influence they had exercised through economic leverage would be absorbed by royal governments that understood commerce as an instrument of national policy. The Hanseatic League story had ended, but the questions they had raised about the relationship between economic power and political authority would continue to shape European development for centuries to come. So we've seen how a confederation of German fish traders became more powerful than kings, controlled the economic lifelines of entire kingdoms, and ultimately collapsed when the world changed faster than they could adapt. But the Hanseatic League's story raises questions that remain relevant today, over 350 years after their final assembly. What does it mean when economic organizations become more powerful than political institutions? When private interests can dictate terms to sovereign governments? When commercial networks transcend national boundaries and operate according to their own logic rather than democratic oversight? Today in 2026, we live in a world where multinational corporations generate more revenue than most national governments, where tech companies control information flows that shape political decisions, where financial networks can crash national economies through coordinated selling pressure, where trade agreements negotiated by business interests can override environmental and labor protections enacted by elected officials. The Hanseatic League pioneered all of these dynamics 6 centuries ago. Consider the parallels. The League's ability to coordinate prices across multiple markets mirrors modern corporate price-fixing scandals. Their use of economic pressure to influence political decisions resembles contemporary corporate lobbying that shapes legislation. Their creation of trade networks that bypass national regulations prefigures modern strategies for avoiding taxation and oversight through complex international corporate structures. Most importantly, the League demonstrated something we're still grappling with. Economic power, once concentrated enough, becomes political power regardless of democratic intentions or constitutional constraints. But the League's ultimate failure also offers lessons about the limits of even the most sophisticated economic dominance. They succeeded for centuries because they adapted continuously to changing conditions. They failed when they became too attached to methods that had brought historical success to recognize that those methods were becoming obsolete. The League's early leaders understood that their power depended on providing services that others needed, but couldn't provide for themselves. They maintained their dominance by constantly innovating in response to new challenges and opportunities, but their later leaders confused their past achievements with permanent advantages. They assumed that their traditional methods would remain effective regardless of changing political and economic conditions. They became prisoners of their own success. This pattern, innovation leading to dominance, dominance leading to complacency, complacency leading to irrelevance, appears throughout business history. It's visible in the rise and fall of companies like Kodak, which dominated photography for decades before being destroyed by digital innovations they'd actually invented but failed to embrace. It's evident in the struggles of traditional retail businesses that couldn't adapt to online commerce quickly enough to remain competitive. The pattern also appears in contemporary politics, where established institutions struggle to address challenges that require new forms of organization and cooperation. The European Union, in many ways, represents an attempt to create the kind of economic coordination that the Hanseatic League achieved through merchant cooperation. But the EU operates through democratic institutions and constitutional frameworks that the League never developed. Whether those democratic constraints will prove sustainable under economic pressure remains an open question. Similarly, international trade organizations like the World Trade Organization attempt to coordinate economic policies across sovereign nations without the political integration that made League cooperation possible. The tensions between national sovereignty and international economic coordination that ultimately destroyed the League continue to challenge contemporary international organizations. But perhaps the most relevant lesson from the Hanseatic League's experience concerns the relationship between economic innovation and social responsibility. The League's merchants were genuinely innovative. Their development of international banking, maritime law, trade standardization, and economic cooperation created wealth and opportunities that benefited millions of people across Northern Europe. Cities prospered, trade flourished, and living standards improved throughout League territories. But their innovations also created concentrations of power that were ultimately incompatible with democratic governance and social equity. The League's ability to manipulate food supplies for political pressure meant that ordinary people suffered when commercial interests conflicted with public welfare. Their control over credit systems meant that entire regions could face economic devastation when League policies changed. Their influence over political succession meant that royal authority became subordinate to merchant interests rather than popular needs. The League never developed institutional mechanisms for ensuring that their economic power served broader social purposes rather than just commercial profits. This tension between economic innovation and democratic accountability remains unresolved in contemporary political economy. We benefit enormously from the innovations that modern corporations provide, technologies that improve health, communication, and quality of life. But we also struggle with concentrations of economic power that can override democratic decision-making and social priorities. The Hanseatic League's story suggests that this tension isn't just a contemporary problem created by modern technology. It's a fundamental challenge that emerges whenever economic organizations become powerful enough to influence political decisions. But their story also suggests reasons for hope. The League's collapse didn't destroy the innovations they'd developed or eliminate the benefits their coordination had created. Instead, their methods were absorbed and improved by the nation-states that replaced them. Modern banking, international law, trade standardization, and economic coordination all trace their origins to techniques the League pioneered. But these innovations were embedded within political structures that provided democratic oversight and constitutional constraints that the League had never established. The League's failure led not to the elimination of international economic cooperation, but to its improvement through integration with democratic political institutions. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson. Economic innovation and political innovation must develop together. Economic organizations that become more powerful than the political institutions designed to oversee them will ultimately face the same fate as the Hanseatic League. Success followed by irrelevance when changing conditions require adaptations they can't or won't make. But political institutions that can't adapt to economic innovations will also become obsolete, leaving societies vulnerable to economic powers operating without democratic constraint. The challenge for our time, as it was for the League's era, is creating institutional arrangements that harness the benefits of economic innovation while ensuring that economic power serves democratic purposes rather than replacing democratic authority. The Hanseatic League proved that such arrangements are possible, for a time, but they also proved that maintaining them requires constant adaptation, democratic vigilance, and willingness to reform successful institutions when success threatens the values that made them valuable in the first place. Whether we can learn from their example or are doomed to repeat their pattern of innovation, dominance, complacency, and collapse remains the great question of our economic and political future. The merchants of medieval Lübeck couldn't have imagined the global economy we inhabit today. But the choices they made about power, cooperation, and responsibility continue to shape the choices we face about the kind of economic and political future we want to create. Their story ended in failure, but it doesn't have to be our story. If we can learn from their achievements and their mistakes, perhaps we can build economic institutions that serve human flourishing rather than just commercial success. That would be a legacy worthy of the innovative spirit that made the Hanseatic League one of history's most remarkable organizations.